Hello, everybody, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Dani, and today, Great.com talks with Holly Lilly, the Executive Director at the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation. Now, if you haven't heard of it yet, they champion for injured and orphaned wildlife through rescue, rehabilitation, and release. Before we begin our talk today, remember, if you're new here to this podcast, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app. Hello, Holly, and welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. I loved your website. I always highlight when I love someone's website. And
that's awesome.
It was really incredible. And let's begin knowing more about your story. How did you begin working there?
So I started with Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation about 8.5 years ago. So I've been in the field of wildlife rehabilitation for nearly 16 years now. So I started quite early. I did some work in Texas before that with big cats. So there's unfortunately an issue with how easy it is to have big cats as pets. And I volunteered at a cat rescue there. So that really kind of propelled me into the field of animal care and welfare. And when I moved to Canada, I started volunteering at a wildlife rehabilitation organization close to home. So through that, I've been able to get more experience, do some professional development, and then worked my way up to a paid staff member as a wildlife rehabilitator, then a rehabilitation manager, and now executive director. So I don't do the hands-on care necessarily with the animals as much. I do more of the operations and fundraising and so forth. But it's a very rewarding experience either way, and I find that my direct animal care experience lends very helpfully to fundraising and knowing what to ask for and how to ask for it and so forth.
Wow, yeah, and I can imagine how fulfilling it must be. You've been working with this for a long road, right? It must be something that has grown with you. And how did the Institute really begin? When and how did that happen?
So the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation, it was founded in 1993. So it's actually our 30th anniversary next year. We turn 30 on April 20th, 2023. So it was founded by Diane Whitner, and she started the organization in her basement. So we're still on the original land. We bought the land a few years ago, and we operate on the full nearly 10 acres now. Diane has since retired and moved away. And in the beginning, there was, let's say 100 animals coming in a year, and now we're up to nearly 2,000 animals a year. So it's grown a lot. We've also expanded to include other programs. So not only do we do the wildlife rehabilitation, but we also have wildlife education and wildlife hotline and rescue as well.
That's awesome. And let us help us actually try to understand a bit better what are we talking about when we think about Alberta's wildlife. Where are the animals most commonly found there?
So Alberta is home to an abundance of wildlife. We're so to live here. I'm not here from here originally. I'm from England originally and then moved around quite a bit, but over 480 species of wildlife call Alberta home. So there's the big iconic ones, which I'm sure people will be familiar with, like the grizzly bear and the moose, but there's also porcupines, and there is weasels and bats and lots of different birds. We are in a migratory pathway. So what that means is that we see huge numbers of wildlife migrate here in the summer to reach their breeding grounds, and then they leave in the fall. So even now, each night when we go to bed, we live in a rural area, and I can hear the sandhill cranes flying overhead as they're migrating south for the winter. So we're very lucky to live here, and there's just a huge amount of wildlife. So at our institute, what we do is we see a number of birds. So it varies every year, but we see about 75 to 78% birds, and the rest would be mammals. So we are permitted by two bodies of government. So we're permitted by the federal government of Canada, and they enable us to care for migratory birds. So those would be your swans and geese and so forth, songbirds as well. And then we're also permitted by the provincial government, which is Alberta Environment and Parks, and they mandate what species we can and cannot rehabilitate, including the mammals. So we are limited in some animals that we can rehabilitate. For example, we can't rehabilitate grizzly bears, regardless of whether they're adults or calves. We can rehabilitate black bear calves, so we're the only centre in the province that can rehabilitate black bear calves. And we have 3 in care right now. We have 2 girls and a boy, and they're just getting ready for release. And then there's other animals like wolves we're not able to rehabilitate, cougars, bighorn sheep, mountain goats. So there's a list that we follow, but with the exception of the animals on the restricted list, we can rehabilitate wildlife. So our mission is that we are committed to the rescue, rehabilitation, and release of injured and orphaned wildlife. And then we also provide education that fosters an appreciation of wildlife. Like I said, we're home to such an abundance of wildlife in the province, and the majority of cases that we see are human related in some way. So we attribute about 95% of the cases we see as a result of human conflict in some ways. So that could be hitting a car, hitting a window, being caught by a cat or a dog, hitting a power line, being poisoned, and so forth. So we really do focus on the education piece because we need to live alongside wildlife. As urban expansion continues, there's human encounters are growing. We saw that especially during the pandemic. We believe that, people will home more and in their backyards more and exploring. And so we did see a huge increase in patients in 2020. So that education component is vital to us living alongside wildlife in Alberta.
Absolutely. I can imagine how vital it must be. And also, I keep imagining how beautiful this region must look like and how privileged it is to live there. You mentioned a lot of things, and I'm going to pick some of them right now, because you said that you work with conservation and rehabilitation. And I just don't want to take those things for granted, just pretend that I fully know what they entail. What is the difference between each of them, and why some species you can actually work on and rehabilitate and others you don't? What is the difference in there?
So some of the species that we can't rehabilitate would be restricted by the government. And then there's other species that we don't have the resources to care for. And that would be where the conservation part comes in. So for example, invasive species. So what we would see in our area would be rock pigeons, eastern grey squirrels, European starlings. So those and a couple of others, those would be what we would term invasive species. And we just don't have the resources to give everything that we need to them, as well as our native species. So for those, if we're able to, we will transfer to other facilities, and that usually works quite well. For the rehabilitation portion, we will accept any, again, that we're able to legally allowed to take. So we're very mindful that there's some species that we're not able to care for. So for example, the adult deer and things like that. So for those, we have a process where we will refer to the local conservation office so that they can hopefully assist in that call. But within the parameters of our permits, we do otherwise rehabilitate every species that we can. And rehabilitation essentially, in a nutshell, is admitting them, assessing them, and then determining a treatment plan. And part of a treatment plan, which may surprise people, is also euthanasia. So we do see euthanasia as part of the treatment plan. We see animals that come in horrendous conditions. If you have a pet cat or something, you may be familiar with this, but wildlife, especially like cats, they don't show when they're hurt. They don't show when they're sick, because this is a red flag to all other animals in the area, and it's a huge danger to them. So when we do get wildlife in, they're in really horrendous conditions of missing limbs, body parts open and things like that, not to get too gruesome, but it can be very severe. So we're simply not able to save every animal, but we want to provide them with a good death, which is the definition of euthanasia. So we provide them with a humane euthanasia on site. For birds of prey, there is a feather bank program in the province. So what that means is that we save all of our carcasses, all of the animals that unfortunately aren't able to be saved, and then they are sent off to an incinerator. But the birds of prey specifically, they're entered into a feather bank program in the province. So what that means is that those feathers are then taken off by the government, and they are distributed to First Nations groups and others. So those feathers are then repurposed in that way. So which is obviously, of huge importance in ceremonial occasions and so forth. So, yeah, that's how we manage with the rehabilitation. Not every animal, thankfully, has to be euthanized. Otherwise, it would be a very hard job, but it is definitely a reality. And then for the animals that thankfully are able to go on and be rehabilitated, they go into our rehabilitation program. And rehabilitation can take anywhere from a few days to a few months or a couple of years. So we have a young beaver kid at the moment, so a baby beaver, and typically they stay in care for about 2 years. So we knew that before we accepted him as a patient, and we would have accepted him regardless. But it is a huge commitment and a time and a financial commitment to care for him. So it really depends on the injury and also the time of year and the species as well. So where we're located, we're heading into winter. It comes quite quickly here. We'll be getting snow, who knows when, very quickly. So we're also facing, challenges with animals migrating, but they don't heal until the snow is flying, and then we can't release them in those conditions because they're not native to here and they can't adapt. So we also see that we have to overwinter some species as well.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing those details. So many things that I did not know. And also thank you for sharing this euthanasia bit. I think it's something that we don't talk often, and there is sometimes a necessary solution, right, to protect the animals. Wow. And talking about learning, tell me more about the educational actions that you've been taking recently, as you mentioned, especially after COVID, because this is really something interesting, and I'm trying to see better or have clarity on how do you begin talking and explaining folks about this.
So we have different ways of providing education. So there's maybe the more obvious ones like social media. Whenever we can, we provide educational posts, whether it's through, we have a Fact Friday segment on our Facebook, which is done by a volunteer. And, especially seasonally as well. So when skunks are breeding here in February, usually we get a lot of calls about people that are smelling skunks and they're seeing skunks more because they're out and about more in breeding season. So we try and tie it with things going on in the year as well. So social media is a big part of that. We also have our wildlife hotline service. So we really invested in this through volunteers and a paid staff member a few years ago. So this is a free service open to, and all of our programming is our wildlife rehabilitation program is free as well. We don't charge for those services. For the wildlife hotline, we are open 365 days a year, the same as our rehabilitation program. And it's a number that people can call if they have questions or concerns about wildlife. So if they see an animal in their backyard or if they're out and about and they have questions or concerns, they can give us a call. What we really like about this program is that it is very beneficial in deterring healthy wildlife from coming into our care. So, for example, baby hares, their natural history is that they are left alone during the day. They're not with mom, they're born with their eyes open and they're fully furred. But understandably, people can come across a very tiny baby without a mum and think that there's something wrong with that animal. So through our wildlife hotline, we're able to triage and then ascertain if the animal is in fact injured or orphaned. And it's about 200 to 300 animals every year that we can prevent from coming into our doors, because we know through the education component of educating on the animal's natural history that they don't need to come into care. So that's fantastic. That would have been a lot of stress to those animals. So that's really important. And then we have our wildlife education program. And through this, we provide education to school groups and adult groups, where we go out and we spread the word about wildlife and wildlife in Alberta. So we really do believe that through programming that we can provide we can help create a strong coexistence between wildlife and Albertans. Like I said before, there's a huge amount of wildlife here, and it's very important that we learn how to live alongside them. They're not going anywhere. Obviously, humans aren't going anywhere either. So we have to learn how to adapt. And animals are very good at adapting to us, but we're not very good at adapting to animals, unfortunately. So the wildlife education program is open to all years. We have a fantastic community engagement coordinator who goes out to school groups and adult groups and presents on different topics. So whether it's wildlife in your backyard or owls of Alberta and bats and things like that, it's it's really important to especially educate the younger generations so that they can grow up having an appreciation of wildlife, and also trying to dispel some of the myths and the fears around wildlife too. You know, there's a lot of fear usually around animals that have a negative connotation. So for example, skunks and bats, there's a lot of fear around those animals, but if we can help dispel some of those myths, I think it really does go a long way in those animals over time being looked upon more favorably and more likely to get help if they are in need as well.
Absolutely. I loved all the things that you said. And for everybody listening or watching us that really want to get more information about the work, please go to their website, which is AIWC for Alberta Wildlife Conservation .ca. So AIWC.ca. Get there, you can get way more information than we are going to cover here today. And you can get in touch with them, which is something very, very important too. But now another question for you is that what is next? Like you mentioned this crisis that you saw, these numbers, the increase in the numbers after the COVID. So what is in the future for you? What is the next step?
Yeah, so definitely the demand for our services are increasing. You know, I always say and think, you know, in an ideal world, wildlife rehabilitation centres wouldn't need to exist. Like I mentioned earlier, 95% of the cases that come to us as a result of human conflict in some way or human encounters. So it's very rarely natural predation that we see animals coming into our care. So demand for our services is growing. Even this year, we are up about 9% last year. So we've already taken in more animals this year than we did in all of 2021. And we still have a few months to go. So it's scary, to, you know, and a daunting task. The same with the wildlife hotline, that's experienced a huge increase in demand as well. So with that, we are working on more fundraising. Unfortunately, we're not, and no centre in Canada, unfortunately, any wildlife rehabilitation centre, we're not funded by the government. So we don't have any guaranteed reliable income. So we operate through all of our own fundraising. So that's asking for donations and applying for grants and so forth. So with an increased demand, obviously comes increased costs. So our biggest challenge is continuing to meet that demand through fundraising. And then also with more patients, obviously comes more need for more space. So we're lucky to reside in just under 10 acres, and we do have room to expand out there. So that's one of our goals too. We're working on master planning of our site. We want to plan the enclosures that we want to build for the next 5, 10, 15 years to ensure that we don't run out of space, because that can be quite easy to do. So that's a big focus. We have new enclosures coming. We have a new enclosure for black bears coming and a new enclosure for raptors coming. Both of those are funded, which is fantastic. We've just experienced delays, as I'm sure, you know, many people have, in terms of securing contractors and supplies due to the pandemic and things like that. So that's unfortunate, but we're moving in the right direction with those. So that's where we're headed. Further down the line, we really do need to look at getting a new hospital for our facility. So our facility right now is actually a church that was moved from a location about 40 minutes north of us, and then was moved to our property in the 90s there. So it's an interesting shaped building. There's lots of little pockets, which we've made work for. It's a very functional hospital, and we are a hospital, so we're actually accredited by the Alberta Veterinary Medical Association. So we have surgery on site and X-ray and things like that. We're able to do a lot of diagnostics in-house to reduce patient stress and not transfer them out or wait for delays from labs and things like that. But as we see more patients, and as we also learn more about wildlife rehabilitation, we want to keep certain species separate to reduce stress and so forth. So that'll be further down the line too, is doing a capital campaign to fundraise for a new hospital to meet our growing demand.
Well, that's a great next step. And how can we all listening help you get there? What are the best ways to help you keep going?
So there's lots of ways, and it doesn't have to be a financial commitment. Even posts, you never know who in your network may come across an animal in need and really need that number. And even if you're outside of the province or outside the country, you can always message us on social media if you have questions, and we can try and help point you in the right direction. So definitely, yeah, liking and following on social media is fantastic. We have a wealth of information on our website as well, AIWC.ca. So if you're interested in volunteering, if you live locally, or if you are interested in donating and finding out more, that would be fantastic as well. And just in your general area, if you're not local to us, if you're interested in learning more about wildlife rehabilitation, then perhaps find your closest wildlife centre. I guarantee you they will need volunteers. We're primarily running volunteers, and there's many ways that you can help. And you can find your local wildlife centre by checking out National Wildlife Rehabilitation Association. I believe you can find your local wildlife centre there if that's something that you're interested in.
That is great. And thank you so much for joining and talking to us today. I loved this conversation.
Thank you very much.
And for everybody listening, also, thank you. And remember, if you enjoyed this episode, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that shows the algorithms that this is an important conversation and more people can learn about the importance of the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation. Bye, and see you the next episode.